All right. Can you all see my screen? The PowerPoint slide? Okay. So I've been asked to present Indonesia's post-reformasi presidential election system, which means it's a system that's been enforced since the 2004 elections. So about International Idea, we are not an NGO, but we are an intergovernmental organization. So we have member states, and we were established in 1995. So if you look at the democratic history, after the end of the Cold War, there were many democracies that have sprung up in the early 90s. So in 1995, a number of member states, a number of countries got together to set up an intergovernmental organization specifically dedicated to supporting democracy worldwide. And we're a think and do tank, which means that we produce research, publications, comparative data, and at the same time we help ensure that these materials are able to be used and are useful for policy development, policy making at country, regional, and global levels. And yeah, so 1995, that means we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. Okay, I mentioned about member states. We have 33 member states. Japan is an official observer, and Indonesia is a member of International Idea since 2013. And our membership is quite broad, and it's diverse. It's got advanced democracies, got new democracies, developing democracies, rich country, poorer country, and all continents, from all continents. So we believe that we are enriched by this diversity. Now, going into the more substantive side of our presentation now. So Indonesia has adopted a presidential system of government. And this was done by our founding fathers. You can see in the pictures on the right there. These are pictures of the members of the preparatory committee for the independence of Indonesia. This was in 1945. And the founding fathers consciously decided to make Indonesia at the time, in 1945, adopting a presidential system of government. But one needs to acknowledge that the 1945 Constitution was initially a temporary constitution. It's a transitional constitution, which is why if you look at the timeline on the left there, from 1945 to 1950, that transitional constitution was enforced. And there was a short-lived federal system actually in Indonesia from 1949 to 1950. So the president became like a head of the federal state, with another president for the smaller Republic Indonesia, which was part of the which was one of the federal countries. I won't go into detail of that, of course. And then in 1950, there was another temporary constitution promulgated, which had a parliamentary system. So we've had a series of parliamentary governments between 1950 and 1959. So during that period, we didn't have. During that period, we didn't have a presidential system. Although we did have a president still as head of state, but the head of government was a prime minister. Now, if you look at the picture, that's the meeting of the Constituent Assembly. So it wasn't exactly a parliament, but it was a Constituent Assembly charged to, among others, not only run the country, but also to come up with a permanent constitution. Between 1950 and 1950, the first elections ever was actually held in 1955, again to elect members of this assembly. But then in 1959, because of a standoff between the president and the assembly, the president decreed that Indonesia goes back to the 1945 constitution. So thereby bringing back the presidential system of government. And President Sukarno, our first president, forgot to show you this picture. This is about the 5th July decree, 1959 decree, bringing back Indonesia to the 1945 constitution. So President Sukarno stayed in power from 1959 onwards. I don't really remember the year, but probably 1962, the Supreme Council of Indonesia declared President Sukarno president for life. So from that point onwards, it seemed like the 1945 Constitution and President Sukarno would be present as long as he lives. And then there were turns of events that occurred in 1965 that led to change in policy. The eventual second president, Suharto, was inaugurated acting president in 1967. So he was acting president at first and then became definitive president a year later. And during his regime, called the New Order regime, the presidential system in the 1945 Constitution was further entrenched. The presidential system in force was actually useful for whoever the president is or was, because it was executive heavy. So the president had a lot more power than they have today, with minimal checks and balances from the legislative and judicial branches. So that that system remained until President Suharto stepped down in 1998, and he was continued by his then vice president, President Habibie, the late President Habibie, which during that period he's considered as a transitional president, because that's when Reformasi started. And so after that, since there were constitutional amendments, a series of constitutional amendments happening, from 99 to 2003, if I'm not mistaken, or two, where the balance of power, the powers of the president was recalibrated. Okay, so what are the current powers of the president? So the president, one needs to understand that he is the head of state and head of government at the same time. So in that sense, it's similar to the United States. So he appoints ministers and ambassadors, promulgate laws, sign laws into force, and then the executive, the government, actually write laws together with the People's Representative Council, or DPR. So this is interesting because it's effectively a silent veto. So unlike the US, we don't have the formal presidential veto, where if the president don't agree with the laws enacted by Congress, then the president can veto it. In Indonesia, a president, if he or she doesn't agree with the law, then he or she can wait, is it 30 days? After which the law comes into force automatically. So there's no veto in that sense. But there is a silent veto because the DPR cannot finalize the laws that they make without the participation of the government in the discussions. So there is a formal process where the president must appoint an envoy that will become the partner of the DPR in deliberating the law. This is not well known, I know, but there's a scholar, Dr. Stephen Sherlock, who's written about this, and I think he's correct in that sense. And then the president also has the power to enact a government regulation in lieu of a law, or we call Perpu, in urgent circumstances. So this is designed to, when the parliament cannot meet or cannot meet in time, then the president has the power to make laws as a government regulation, which in the scheme of things is lower than a law. But in this case, because it's an emergency regulation, it can be seen at the same level as the law, provided, and then at the first session of Parliament, or DPR, this government regulation must be reviewed and voted up or down. So if it's voted up by the DPR, then it becomes law. If it's voted down, then it is revoked and it's no longer in force. So this is designed for emergency situations. And then the president can declare war and make treaties with the approval of DPR. So this is a joint decision, cannot be unilaterally done by the president. Declare state of emergency, and he or she is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And that's, I think those last three are similar to that of in the United States. Now, when we talk about electoral systems, how we can understand and therefore compare electoral systems I'm following a doctrine coined by International Adhy through its handbook, Electoral System Design Handbook, whereby there are 3 elements of an electoral system. The first one is ballot structure. Ballot structure, the method which the is it by putting a mark? Is it by punching like in Indonesia? Or is it stamping like in South Korea? So different electoral systems have different methods of these. The other element or sub-element within the ballot structure is what do you put on the ballot? Is it the candidate's name? Is it the political party's name? Is it the candidate's picture? Is it the political party's symbols? All these elements, all these variations determine an electoral system. The second element is district magnitude. So what district magnitude literally means is how many seats are being elected in a particular electoral area. So electoral area are usually based on certain geographical area. It can be just drawn out of a map, or it can be based on a combination of political subdivisions. So district magnitudes can be from 1 to whatever, depend. There's no there's no limit actually. But for presidential elections, it's usually 1. You're electing 1 president, aren't you? The only difference is probably in some countries, the elections run as an individual, or in other countries, they run as a ticket with a vice presidential nominee, for example. So the significance of district magnitude is what you can see in the graph on the screen here, that it determines the proportionality, or one may say disproportionality of the election result. And proportionality relates to the adherence to the universal principle of 1 person, 1 vote, 1 value. So as the graph shows, the higher the district magnitude meaning the more seats there are in an electoral district,
Correct.
the less disproportionate or the more proportional the election result would be. So in the US, for example, there are single member districts for congressional elections. That means there's only 1. So the district magnitude is 1. And as you can see, the graph shows that it can be very disproportionate in terms of the results. So district magnitude is another element that differentiates electoral systems. The third element is formula. Now, formula is the mathematical equation used to determine a winner. So the most well-known is 50% plus 1. And then in proportional representation systems, there are various formula or quota formula. There's one example there. Total number of valid ballot cast in the district divided by 1 plus number of members to be elected, and then plus 1. So it can be complicated, but it can be as simple as 50% plus 1. And then in a number of countries, there are thresholds. So there are electoral thresholds, which means that if a party don't receive a certain amount of popular vote, then they can qualify to enter parliament. So basically, they're then disqualified. And different countries have different thresholds. Indonesia has that as well for parliament. But for presidential elections, the thresholds are usually a nomination threshold. So it's not whether or not you can be elected, but whether or not you can run as a contestant. Just a second. Okay. And so those three elements. Okay. Yeah. So these three elements combined determine an electoral system. So there are so many electoral systems in the world. That's because these different elements have different combinations. Now, let's look at the presidential election systems of Indonesia, and to aid you in understanding, I'm comparing it to the US system. Now, in terms of ballot structure, you can see the Indonesian ballot on the left there. It's got numbers, candidate numbers. It's got pictures of the candidates. It's got the names of the candidate pairs, one for president and the other one's for vice president. And starting in 2019, I believe, the symbols of the political parties who are proponents of these candidates are also present in the ballot. Yeah, and then all those, the numbers, the pictures, the names are put in a box. You can see that it is a box. There are two boxes here. That's significant because the voters' punch mark has to be within these boxes. If it's outside, then it's deemed invalid. Yeah. So the method is punching ballot. What's on the ballot are the numbers of the candidate numbers, pictures, and the names. Yeah. Now let's have a look at the a couple of examples from the U.S. In the U.S., there are so many different variations. That's because, as you know, the presidential elections are actually run at state level. So the candidates may differ from state to state. I remember Stephen Colbert ran in his home state of North Carolina, Did he actually run, or was it just he tried? I can't remember. So it can be different from one state to another, as you can see. But same like Indonesia, it's a candidate pair. So president, vice president, president, vice president. And then there's the name of the party there. And in both cases here, there can be write-in candidates. You can see write-in candidates, whereas in Indonesia, you cannot. There cannot be write-in candidates there. So that's part of the elements of, or sub-elements of a ballot structure. Next, district magnitude. Now, in Indonesia, the whole country is the district. So a president gets elected based on votes the pair gets in the entire country. There's a caveat to that, which I'll explain in the next slide. Now, if we compare it to the US with its electoral college system, the electoral districts are actually the states. It's not the entire country, it's the states. And because it's electoral college system, the voters are actually electing the representatives that will attend the college. Whereas in Indonesia, even though if you saw in the ballot, it's both candidate names on the ballots, but if we look at the element or the district magnitude element, it's actually different. Because in Indonesia, the voters are actually voting for those persons on the ballot, but in the US, they're actually voting for delegates or representatives, and the number of delegates differ from state to state, and therefore you can tell that there is a difference in the district magnitudes. So this goes to the proportionality issue that I raised in the previous slide, where district magnitude determines proportionality, and therefore, because the number of population in each state in the United States gets, through a certain formula, gets translated into number of delegates, there may be a discrepancy in terms of the proportionality because of that translation process. Yeah, whereas in Indonesia, it's the value of the votes from one province to another is the same, because there is no need for translating number of population into a certain number of delegates. In a legislative context, it's translating number of population to number of seats, hence district magnitude. Yeah, so there's a difference there. Let's see the third element, which is formula. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier, but let's look at the United States first. So the president gets elected if he or she gets 50% plus one of the electoral college. Where electoral college is not the same as popular vote. This is what I told you about proportionality just now. Because of the discrepancy or deviation, the electoral college no longer reflects popular vote. So famously, Donald Trump lost on popular vote. George Bush, I think, in 2004, I think. 2000, sorry, in 2000, lost the popular vote to Al Gore, and yet they became president. So there's the difference. In Indonesia, it's 50% plus one of popular vote. So the constitutional framers made sure of this, that whoever is elected president must have garnered more than popular vote. And here's the caveat I mentioned earlier. And at least 20% of the total provincial votes in at least 50% of the provinces. Which means that an elected candidate not only has to have 50% plus one of popular vote, the candidate pair must also have gotten a substantial support across Indonesia. So that's the intention. And mathematically, the framers of the Constitution has put it as at least 20% of the total provincial votes in at least 50% of provinces. So in at least 50%, half of the provinces, the candidate pair who got 50% plus one of the popular vote must also have gotten more than 50%, more than 20%. So if you look at the data on the right here from the 2019 elections, these are data by province, all right? These are provinces. And as you can see, President Jokowi has gotten more than 20% in quite many provinces. And I don't know exactly how many, but I can guarantee you it's more than half. Right. Now, this is, of course, this requirement, of course, can be fulfilled with relative ease because there were only two candidates. So one questions, why then the constitutional framers put in this requirement? Mathematically, it's very likely for the winner to also more than 20% in half of the provinces. Now, first of all, we need to understand that the demographics of Indonesia is as such that the population is not spread evenly. There's I don't know exactly how many now, but the general understanding is that 60% of Indonesia's population live in the smallest of the 5 major islands in Indonesia, Java. So 60% live in Java. And then 40% in the vast area, the rest of the country. So the framers of the Constitution wants to avoid a situation where a candidate for president is extremely popular in one island, say Java, and gets elected without sufficient support elsewhere. Okay, that's first. Now, second, and this is debatable, and I can see Justice Professor Saudi Israel on the line, and he would know better than I am. But one may say that the second reason is because the constitutional framers are expecting more than 2 candidates in the elections, which is why Indonesia's electoral system for president is actually a 2-round system. But that's debatable at the moment, at least. Now, this brings me, the talk about the number of candidates brings me to the infamous threshold. So as I mentioned earlier, this threshold is not a threshold like a parliamentary threshold where it determines whether or not you can fill your seat, but it's a nomination threshold, which means it determines whether or not you can be fielded as candidate. Now, one is to understand that there cannot be independent candidates in Indonesia for president. Yeah, well, for any elections, I guess. And the Constitutional Court has made clear of this. So the threshold is actually related to the amount of support political parties have in nominating the candidate pairs. So the threshold applies to the parties nominating candidate pairs. So as you can see in the table here, when the threshold first introduced in the for the first presidential elections, first ever direct presidential elections in 2004, the threshold was 5% of the popular vote. The parties nominating the candidates combined must have at least 5% of the popular vote, or 3% of the DPR seats. So there can be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parties joining each other and nominate a candidate pair. And then the number of votes they have garnered in the previous elections, legislative elections, if combined, they have garnered more than 5% of the popular votes, or combined, they have gotten more than 3% of DPR seats based on the immediate legislative elections, then they are qualified to field a candidate pair. Now, in 2009, or from 2009 presidential elections, the threshold was significantly raised from 5% of the popular vote to 25% of the popular vote, or from 3% of the DPR seats to 20% of the DPR seats. Now, who determined this, you may ask? It's not the Constitution. These thresholds are not in the Constitution. They are actually promulgated, included in a law. A law that was explicitly delegated by the Constitution. So the Constitution explicitly delegated additional legal provisions to be governed by statutory law. And as a result, the lawmakers, DPR and the executive government, together they came up with these requirements. Now, as a result of the significant increase in the threshold, you can see that the number of candidates decreased, initially to 3, and then for the last 2 elections, only 2 candidates. Yeah. Now, as a result, if there are only 2 candidates, then the elections are only 1 round. Yeah. And it's important to note that from 2019 presidential elections onwards, the popular vote requirement for the parties are actually 4 years old. Because for 2004, 2009, 2014 elections, the presidential elections were held about 4 months after the legislative elections. 3 months after the presidential, the legislative elections. So for those 3 years, it's the popular vote gained in the April elections, legislative elections, that were used of the same year, April of the same year. Now, in 2019, because legislative and presidential elections were held on the same day at the same time, a threshold that used to be only 3 months old can no longer be used. Popular vote data, I mean, that's usually 3 months old, can no longer be used because the elections just happened. So instead, data from the previous legislative elections, which, as I said, is 4 years old, was used. Now, why 4 years old? Because that's when if it's on election day, then that's 5 years old. But nomination for president takes place sometime before that. So that's why it's less than 5 years old. So it's just a minutiae detail that I had to explain. So yeah, so this threshold has consequences and is much debated. But I believe the Constitutional Court decided that it's up to the lawmakers, because the Constitution has delegated explicitly to make election rules that are supplementary to the principles that are present in the Constitution. Now, talking about, so who organized elections in Indonesia, including presidential elections? Now, Indonesia has a centralized election management, and this is attributable to the fact that we are a unitary state. So the Constitution has actually set the principles of the election organizers. It has to be permanent, meaning that it's not an ad hoc body. It's set up for the election and then disbanded after an election. No, the body has to exist permanently. And then it's national in nature, hence the centralized election management. And it's independent. So there cannot be party representatives in the election management body. So this is different to the US, this part. In fact, the Constitutional Court, in a case, made clear that a candidate as an election commissioner must have already withdrawn from a political party membership at least 5 years before nomination. So this is to ensure the independence and non-partisanship of the election commissioners. According to international idea, there are 3 types of election management. The first one is independent. Second is mixed. The third is governmental model. So Indonesia has chosen the independent type. And then Indonesian elections are funded out of national budget. So this goes in line with the constitutional principle of national plan. In the United States, it's decentralized, possibly because it's a federal state. But in Australia, for a federal election, for example, it has a centralized election management. Australia is also a federal state. Canada is another example. And then procedures may differ from state to state. Now in Indonesia, that cannot be the case. So the election procedures must be the same in one part of the country to another. In the US, I understand there can be different methods in voting methods. There can be different electoral machines, election voting machines used in different states, different counties. So in Indonesia, that cannot be the case. It has to be uniform throughout the country. And then in the US, it's funded by governments of federal, state, local, and smaller political subdivisions. This is for federal elections, yeah? It can be a combination of funding. Whereas in Indonesia, for national elections, it must be funded out of national budget. Yeah, I think that's it from me. It's just meant to be an introduction. There may be errors in my presentation, which other learned scholars in the room can correct, and also maybe add things that I may have missed. But again, it's meant to be an introduction, and looking forward to the discussions we shall have.